There is a precise moment in every toxic dynamic when the balance shifts not through shouting or the pursuit of revenge, but through a profound and irreversible awakening. When a narcissist finally betrays a super-empath, something fundamental and permanent breaks, not just within the relationship, but deep inside the psychological structure of the narcissist themselves. A narcissist survives on external validation in much the same way that human lungs depend on oxygen to function. What many people struggle to grasp is that this validation is not merely about receiving attention. It is a mechanism for emotional regulation. This supply stabilizes their incredibly fragile self-image and acts as a barrier, protecting them from the deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and insecurity that they work so tirelessly to conceal from the world. When a super-empath enters their life, a powerful and transformative process begins. The narcissist discovers something far more potent than simple admiration. They find true emotional attunement. The super-empath has a natural ability to sense moods, perceive subtle shifts, anticipate hidden needs, diffuse tensions, and offer reassurance, often without even being prompted to do so. This dynamic feels intoxicating to a narcissist because it establishes a steady, reliable, and abundant stream of emotional supply. It is vital to understand that a super-empath is fundamentally different from someone who simply possesses average levels of empathy. They do not just sympathize. They deeply absorb and process the emotional states of those around them. Their core desire is to create harmony, to foster healing, and to build a connection that feels truly meaningful and transformative. In the beginning, this creates what appears to be a perfect match. The narcissist feels completely seen, deeply admired, and consistently prioritized. The super-empath feels needed, valued, and bonded through the intensity of the connection. However, beneath this attractive surface, the narcissist is merely attaching themselves to the supply rather than the actual soul of the person. The superempathy becomes the ultimate mirror for the narcissist. Through this reflective bond, the narcissist sees an inflated, idealized version of themselves, a person who is admired, respected, and fundamentally important. The validation provided by the empath serves to strengthen the narcissist's false self, which is the carefully constructed identity they have built to hide their own shame and inner void. Every compliment offered, every act of extreme patience shown, and every instance of forgiveness granted after mistreatment only serves to reinforce the narcissist's dangerous illusion that they are superior and rightfully entitled to such unwavering devotion. This is exactly why the moment of betrayal becomes so catastrophic. When a narcissist decides to betray a super-empath, whether through calculated lies, systematic manipulation, overt emotional abuse, or infidelity, they operate under the assumption that the cycle will simply continue as it always has. They certainly expect tears and they likely expect anger, but they ultimately bank on the expectation of forgiveness. They have conditioned themselves to believe that the heart of the empath is an infinite resource and that this emotional supply is a permanent fixture in their lives. What they completely fail to understand is that the giving nature of the super-empath is firmly rooted in deep-seated values, not in inherent weakness. Once those core values are violated beyond the point of repair, a radical internal shift takes place. Internally, the empath begins the process of withdrawing emotionally. This does not happen through a dramatic outburst or a visible spectacle. Rather, it happens energetically and quietly. And in that quiet space, the steady stream of supply begins to dry up. For the narcissist, this experience feels like a slow, terrifying suffocation. The constant reassurance they relied upon vanishes. The emotional cushioning that protected them from their own reality is gone. The immediate validation they required to function is no longer being provided. Without that consistent external reinforcement, the narcissist is forced to try and self-regulate, which is a skill many of them have never learned how to develop. Their sense of self-worth, which was entirely dependent on the affirmations of others, begins to wobble uncontrollably. They may attempt to provoke reactions from the empath simply to regain some sense of control. They may escalate their manipulation tactics or suddenly offer grand empty promises of change. All of these behaviors are desperate, frantic efforts to restore the flow of supply that was once so effortless. But once the super-empath detaches fully, the mirror effectively shatters. Without that mirror to reflect their greatness, the narcissist is left standing alone, facing a reflection of themselves that they find impossible to tolerate. The emptiness they have feared for so long finally surfaces, and the deep-seated insecurity begins to rise to the surface. The grandiose mask they have worn for years begins to crack because there is no longer a person present to constantly reinforce it. The super-empath was never just a partner. They were the essential stabilizing force that held the narcissist's emotional illusion together. The true tragedy for the narcissist is that authentic healing would require them to embrace vulnerability, take full accountability for their actions, and engage in genuine self-reflection. These are qualities that directly threaten their carefully constructed identity. Instead of processing the betrayal and the subsequent loss in a healthy or constructive way, they almost always resort to externalizing their blame. They may label the empath as being overly dramatic, disloyal, or cold-hearted. This projection serves to protect their fragile ego in the short term, but it does absolutely nothing to restore the internal stability they have lost. Meanwhile, the super-empath, though wounded, begins the process of reclaiming their emotional energy. What once flowed outward towards someone incapable of appreciating it now begins to flow back inward. Personal boundaries start to strengthen. Self-trust begins to grow, and a sense of clarity finally replaces the confusion of the past. The narcissist cannot easily recover from this because the supply they have lost was not just ordinary admiration, it was deep emotional attunement, which is a rare stabilizing and profoundly regulating force. Losing that kind of connection does not just result in a bruised ego. It destabilizes the entire psychological structure that relied upon it. Narcissists often make the fatal error of confusing empathy with fragility. They interpret the patience of an empath as a tolerance for mistreatment, and they mistake their capacity for forgiveness for a lack of better options. When they encounter a super-empath, this massive misjudgment becomes the very foundation of their eventual downfall. They fail to realize that what appears soft on the surface is almost always rooted in immense, unyielding psychological strength. A super-empath does not endure a toxic situation because they are powerless. They endure because they possess a fundamental belief in the potential for growth. They believe that love, when it is nurtured correctly and reciprocated with respect, has the power to transform even the most broken patterns. This deep-seated belief system makes them incredibly resilient individuals. They are capable of withstanding significant emotional turbulence for much longer than the average person. They have the capacity to rationalize bad behavior, analyze complex trauma histories, and attempt to heal dynamics that others would have abandoned at the first sign of trouble. The narcissist observes this endurance and incorrectly assumes it is a sign of their own superiority. They convince themselves that they have found a partner who will never leave, someone who will always understand them, and someone who will continue to absorb emotional chaos while remaining present. That arrogant assumption feeds their sense of control. What they fail to recognize is that a super-empath is a person who is constantly observing. They are meticulously studying inconsistencies. They are tracking emotional patterns over time. They are acutely aware of the growing imbalance between what they are giving and what they are receiving. Their empathy does not make them blind to the truth. It actually provides them with the data they need to understand the situation fully. Over time, a quiet, undeniable awareness forms within them. The empath eventually realizes that compassion offered without reciprocity eventually devolves into self-abandonment. This realization is the most pivotal moment of their journey. Because when a super-empath reaches this level of clarity, the resulting shift is not impulsive or reactive. It is deeply decisive. Unlike someone who leaves in a fit of anger only to return later out of nostalgia, the super-empath leaves only after they have undergone a long, deep process of internal work. They replay conversations in their mind. They analyze past behaviors and they confront their own denial. Once the truth finally settles into their nervous system, their eventual departure becomes absolutely firm and final. The narcissist never anticipates this kind of quiet firmness. They are accustomed to cycles of tension, conflict, and reconciliation. They expect emotional reactions and dramatic displays. They expect that any exit will be followed by an eventual return. What they are completely unprepared for is the sight of calm, cold detachment. They are simply not equipped to deal with boundaries that do not bend. When the super-empath finally tells the narcissist that this is enough, it is not meant as a threat or a negotiation tactic. It is a final conclusion. This is precisely where the narcissist feels most destabilized, because the power dynamic they have relied upon for so long suddenly flips. The person they spent years underestimating reveals a core of inner steel. The same individual who once overextended their patience now enforces their limits without any apology or hesitation. The emotional accessibility that the narcissist once felt was guaranteed becomes strictly restricted. There is nothing that unsettles a narcissist more than the loss of predictability. The super-empath's true strength lies in their high level of emotional intelligence. They understand that love without mutual respect inevitably erodes the soul. They recognize that offering endless forgiveness without any sign of change simply enables further dysfunction. Once this understanding crystallizes in their mind, their behavior shifts to align with that truth. They no longer argue for the sake of being understood. They no longer beg for the validation they used to crave. They no longer feel the need to over-explain their pain to someone who is incapable of listening. They begin to conserve their energy. For the narcissist, this conservation of energy is experienced as a rejection at the deepest possible level. This is not because they have lost control of someone they viewed as weak, but because they have lost their influence over someone they now realize was always strong. That distinction makes all the difference in the world. Losing someone they perceived as inferior would have been easy enough to justify to their own ego. But losing someone who demonstrates such clarity and self-confidence forces the narcissist to face a very uncomfortable comparison. It confronts them with a truth they have spent their entire lives resisting. The empath grew, and that growth exposes the narcissist's own stagnation. The narcissist may try to reassert their dominance through various means like renewed charm, guilt-tripping, or thinly veiled intimidation. They may try to highlight shared memories or minimize the severity of their past betrayals. But all of these manipulative tactics rely on having access to the empath's emotions. When the super empath no longer reacts in a predictable way, those strategies lose all of their effectiveness. The underestimation they held becomes undeniable. The narcissist realizes often, when it is far too late, that empathy paired with firm boundaries is one of the most formidable combinations a person can possess. They made the mistake of confusing kindness with incapacity. And once that illusion collapses, they are left grappling with the painful reality that the person they thought they could always return to has evolved far beyond their reach. That awareness wounds the narcissist far more deeply than any display of anger ever could. For a narcissist, control is far more than just a behavioral choice. It is their primary psychological anchor. It provides them with a sense of orientation in the world. It gives them the stability they crave. It reassures them that they are powerful, relevant, and somehow immune to the pain of abandonment. Every conversation they steer, every emotional reaction they trigger in another person, and every apology they manage to extract serves to reinforce that sense of dominance. Control is the very architecture of their identity. When a super empath is involved, this architecture becomes even more reinforced. The empath's responsiveness makes the narcissist's influence feel effortless. Their willingness to communicate deeply provides a constant path for emotional access. Their desire to repair any conflict offers the narcissist endless opportunities to regain the upper ground. After every rupture, the cycle continues, and the narcissist grows deeply accustomed to being the central emotional gravity of the relationship. But when that inevitable betrayal occurs and the super empath reaches their own threshold of clarity, something radical happens. The reactions stop. The arguments that once spiraled into intense displays of emotion no longer ignite. The cycle is broken and the power dynamic shifts toward a permanent silent exit. The long, heartfelt messages that once articulated deep feelings finally disappear. The tears that used to validate the narcissist's impact on your life have dried up completely. Instead of active engagement, there is now only distance. Instead of attempts at persuasion, there is total silence. Instead of negotiation, there is a clear, unshakable finality. For a narcissist, this sudden shift feels like a terrifying psychological freefall. Without a constant emotional reaction from you, they are unable to measure their influence over your world. If they cannot exert influence, they cannot confirm their own importance. And if they cannot confirm their importance, their internal narrative begins to destabilize rapidly. The narcissist's illusion of superiority is entirely dependent on having a visible effect on the people around them. If they find they can no longer provoke an emotional response, they start to panic and question their own relevance. That simple, gnawing question threatens the fragile ego they keep hidden beneath the surface. In response, they will likely escalate their tactics in a desperate attempt to restore their internal equilibrium. Subtle jabs will suddenly become much sharper. Their charm will be exaggerated to an uncomfortable degree. Promises of change and growth will appear out of nowhere, seemingly overnight. In many cases, they may even attempt to trigger feelings of jealousy or competition by involving others. These behaviors are never random. They are calculated, frantic attempts to regain their emotional leverage. But when the super-empath has truly detached emotionally, these tactics simply hit a wall. And for the narcissist, that wall is entirely unfamiliar territory. A narcissist expects resistance that they can eventually overcome. They expect to encounter emotions they know how to manipulate. What they are completely unprepared for is true emotional neutrality. When your words no longer carry a sting and their praise no longer excites you, they experience a specific type of ego injury that is incredibly difficult for them to regulate internally. This can create intense agitation, irritability, or even a sense of panic. Their sense of control, which is the very mechanism that kept their deepest insecurities suppressed, begins to fracture. They are suddenly forced into a space where they cannot dictate the emotional climate of the relationship. They cannot script the outcome of every argument. They can no longer guarantee that they occupy the central position in your life. This loss of control exposes their deep dependency, because beneath all their grandiosity, there lies a fundamental reliance on external affirmation. The narcissist depends on other people to stabilize their own self-image. When the super-empath finally withdraws, that primary stabilizing force vanishes into thin air. The narcissist must then face their own emotional dysregulation without the familiar convenient outlet of dominance. Instead of processing the betrayal as a direct consequence of their own actions, they almost always interpret the empath detachment as an act of personal defiance. This perception only fuels their growing resentment. They might label the empath as being cold, ungrateful, or overly dramatic. These projections serve a single purpose: to avoid confronting the terrifying fear that they are no longer in control. Control once allowed them to feel invulnerable to the consequences of their behavior. Losing that control forces their own vulnerability to the surface. For someone who has built their entire identity around a facade of superiority, being vulnerable feels absolutely intolerable. Meanwhile, the super-empath experiences something entirely different. In the process of reclaiming their emotional autonomy, they finally regain their internal stability. Their peace of mind no longer depends on the shifting moods of the narcissist. Their sense of self-worth no longer fluctuates based on whether they are receiving approval or criticism. The very power that once fed the narcissist is now being redirected inward. That contrast only serves to intensify the narcissist's collapse, because the more grounded and centered the empath becomes, the more chaotic and unmet the narcissist feels. The shift is undeniable. The dynamic that once revolved entirely around the narcissist's influence now operates independently of it. And when that control is no longer accessible, the psychological structure built upon it begins to crumble. Indifference is something a narcissist simply cannot metabolize. Anger, yes, they can work with it. Tears, absolutely, they can use those. Even hatred still keeps them feeling relevant. But indifference effectively removes the oxygen from the dynamic. It signals emotional disengagement at the deepest, most fundamental level. And when a super-empath reaches that state of indifference, the psychological impact on the narcissist is profound. In the earlier stages of the relationship, the narcissist feels powerful whenever they can trigger an emotion. If they cause you to feel jealousy, they feel desired. If they provoke anger, they feel significant. If they inspire you to plead for the relationship, they feel superior. Every single emotional reaction you give them confirms that they matter. It reassures them that they still occupy space in your inner world. But silence completely rewrites that script. When the super empath stops responding with emotional intensity, the narcissist initially interprets it as just another phase. They assume the quiet is temporary. They believe you are just processing things, cooling down, and preparing to re-engage with them. This assumption comforts them because it helps them preserve the illusion that their importance is still intact. Then the silence extends far longer than they anticipated. Messages go unanswered or receive only the most minimal polite replies. Their usual emotional hooks are ignored completely. Attempts to provoke jealousy or insecurity receive no visible reaction. Stories that were designed to impress or intimidate you fall flat and go unnoticed. Your energy feels neutral, appearing neither warm nor hostile. This neutrality unsettles the narcissist more than any confrontation ever could, because neutrality suggests true emotional independence. It implies that the narcissist's behavior no longer dictates your inner state, and that realization threatens their core fear, the fear of being insignificant. A narcissist constructs their identity through external reflection. They need to see themselves mirrored in the emotions of the people around them. Without that mirror, their own sense of self begins to blur. Indifference erases the feedback loop they have always relied on. It denies them the confirmation of their power. This is why they often intensify their efforts when they are faced with your silence. They may suddenly express deep vulnerability, confess their regrets, or make grand promises about their transformation. If that fails, they may pivot to criticism, blame, or subtle insults to get a rise out of you. The goal remains exactly the same: to evoke a reaction, any reaction at all. Because for them, even anger restores the dynamic. Anger says that you are still affected by them. Silence says that you are no longer within their reach. For someone whose psychological stability is entirely dependent on their influence over others, that message feels completely annihilating. Internally, this can create intense cognitive dissonance. The narcissist struggles to reconcile how someone who once cared so deeply can now appear so utterly unmoved. They may question the authenticity of the connection you once shared. They may accuse the empath of simply pretending to be cold. These accusations are just defense mechanisms used to protect them from a more painful truth: that emotional access to you has been permanently revoked. The super-empath's silence is not an act of passive aggression. It is a necessary act of emotional conservation. After enduring prolonged cycles of overexertion and disappointment, they choose to prioritize peace over the performance of a relationship. They realize that engaging in the drama only fuels the dysfunction, so they disengage strategically. This deliberate withdrawal transforms the power dynamic completely. Where the narcissist once dictated the emotional climate, they now find themselves operating in a state of total uncertainty. They cannot predict your reactions anymore. They cannot gauge their impact on you. They cannot easily manipulate someone who does not respond. That unpredictability destabilizes them. The narcissist's confidence is often entirely situational, built on the false assumption of consistent influence.